The soft morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Mary pulled into the Veterans Memorial Cemetery parking lot in her old blue Honda. The clock on her dashboard read 6:30 a.m., just like every Sunday for the past 15 years. She smiled at the familiar sight of dew drops glistening on the perfectly trimmed grass between the rows of white headstones. As a hospice nurse working long shifts at the local hospital, Mary was used to early mornings. But these Sunday visits were different. This wasn't work, this was her calling. She reached into the back seat for her worn canvas bag, packed with the same supplies she brought every week: fresh flowers from her garden, a soft brush, a spray bottle filled with clean water, and some rags. The morning air was crisp, and her shoes left dark prints in the wet grass as she walked to her usual starting point. The cemetery was peaceful at this hour, just the way she liked it. Birds chirped their morning songs, and a gentle breeze rustled through the American flags planted beside each grave. "Good morning, everyone," she whispered, as she always did. Mary knew some people might think it strange, talking to gravestones, but to her, each marker represented a real person who had lived, loved, and served their country. Her own father rested here too, though she wouldn't visit his grave until she had tended to others first. That's what he would have wanted. She knelt beside the first headstone, belonging to a World War II veteran who had passed away in 1985. The morning dew had left water spots on the white marble, and some dirt had splashed up during the week's rain. Mary sprayed it gently with water and used her soft brush to clean away the grime, being careful around the engraved letters. "There you go, sir," she said quietly, placing a fresh marigold at the base of the stone. "Looking much better now." As she worked, Mary remembered how this Sunday ritual had started. After her father's funeral, she had noticed how some graves seemed neglected, with no one to care for them. It broke her heart to think of these heroes being forgotten. That very day, she had promised herself she would become their family, in a way. Moving from grave to grave, Mary developed a rhythm. Spray, brush, wipe, flower. Spray, brush, wipe, flower. Each stone got the same careful attention, the same gentle touch. She knew the stories of many of these veterans, not from history books, but from their families who she'd met over the years during her visits. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Mary continued her work, and the first joggers began appearing on the path that circled the cemetery. A few regular visitors nodded to her. They'd seen her here so often they probably thought she was part of the cemetery staff. She didn't mind. This wasn't about recognition. The morning was peaceful, just like every other Sunday. But Mary didn't know that soon. The roar of motorcycle engines would shatter this tranquility, and her simple act of kindness would spark a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others. As she finished cleaning another headstone, she heard the first distant rumble of engines. It was unusual for motorcycles to come through here, especially this early. The sound grew louder, and something about it felt different. More aggressive than the respectful riders who sometimes visited to pay their respects to fallen comrades. Mary straightened up, brushing dirt from her knees. She had faced difficult situations before in her years as a nurse, but something told her this morning was about to test her in a way she hadn't expected. Still, she took a deep breath and stood her ground. These graves were sacred ground, and she wouldn't abandon them, no matter what was coming. The peaceful morning shattered as the motorcycle engines grew louder. Not one or two bikes, but a whole group of them. The sound bounced off the surrounding trees, making it seem like the noise was coming from every direction. Birds that had been singing just moments ago took flight, startled by the sudden commotion. Mary watched as 12 motorcycles roared through the cemetery gates, their riders clearly not concerned about disturbing the sacred space. The bikes were big, mean-looking machines, and their exhausts had clearly been modified to be as loud as possible. The riders circled the cemetery paths like sharks, weaving between the graves with little regard for where they were. Other visitors who had come to pay their respects quickly gathered their belongings. An elderly couple who had been placing flowers at a grave hurriedly walked to their car, the woman clutching her husband's arm. A young mother grabbed her child's hand and practically ran toward the parking lot, looking over her shoulder nervously. The bikers were decked out in leather vests covered in patches, some of which had messages that wouldn't be appropriate to read aloud in church. Their bikes kicked up small clouds of dust as they finally came to a stop near the section where Mary had been working. The sudden silence when they cut their engines was almost as startling as their arrival had been. One of them pulled out a small cooler from his saddlebag and started passing around beer cans. They sprawled across the memorial benches that families usually used while visiting their loved ones' graves, their boots resting on the carefully maintained grass. Their laughter and loud conversations echoed across the grounds, peppered with curse words that made Mary wince. She noticed little things that others might have missed. How some of them kept looking around nervously, as if they weren't completely comfortable with what they were doing. How one of them, probably their leader, kept staring at the rows of headstones with an expression she couldn't quite read. She'd seen that look before, though, in the eyes of family members who were afraid to face their grief. A few of the bikers had started flicking cigarette butts onto the grass. Each one that landed felt like a personal insult to Mary, to the veterans buried here, and to every family member who had ever shed tears on this ground. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was anger, a slow burning, righteous kind of anger that she rarely felt. The sound of another car engine caught her attention. The cemetery groundskeeper was arriving for his morning shift. He took one look at the bikers, shook his head, and drove right past the entrance. Mary couldn't blame him. What could one person do against 12 intimidating bikers? But then she thought about all the people buried here who had faced much worse odds fighting for their country. She looked down at the grave she'd just finished cleaning. The inscription showed that this veteran had fought at Normandy. How could she walk away when these men and women had never backed down from a fight that mattered? Her father had always told her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about doing what's right even when you're scared. Taking a deep breath, Mary set down her cleaning supplies. She smoothed her shirt, squared her shoulders, and began walking toward the group. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, but her steps were steady. She wasn't just walking for herself anymore. She was walking for every veteran resting in this sacred ground, for every family member who had ever mourned here, and for every principle of respect and decency she believed in. The bikers hadn't noticed her yet. She was just a small woman in simple clothes, probably not very impressive looking to them. But as she got closer, she could see their leader more clearly. There was something in his eyes, a hint of pain, maybe even shame, that gave her hope. Maybe, just maybe, this confrontation wouldn't go the way everyone expected. What happened next would change not just this morning, but many mornings to come. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage, and Mary was about to prove that true. The grass crunched softly under Mary's feet as she walked toward the bikers. Her heart was racing, but years of handling difficult situations as a nurse had taught her how to keep her voice steady even when she was nervous. She could smell leather and cigarette smoke as she got closer, and the conversation among the bikers slowly died down as they noticed her approach. The morning sun caught the patches on their vests, some showing military emblems, others displaying messages that would make most people turn away. But Mary wasn't looking at their vests. She was looking at their faces, really looking, the way she'd learned to do with patients and their families. Behind the tough expressions, she saw something familiar, pain, carefully hidden, but definitely there. They had arranged themselves in a loose half-circle on and around the memorial benches. Some sat with their boots propped up. Others stood leaning against their bikes. Beer cans glinted in the morning light. The leader, a tall man with gray streaks in his beard, was sitting in the middle, watching her approach with an unreadable expression. A younger biker nudged his friend and snickered, but the leader shot him a look that quickly silenced him. The morning breeze carried the sound of American flags flapping gently at each grave. a reminder of why she was doing this. Mary thought about all the families who would be arriving later to visit their loved ones, how they shouldn't have to feel afraid to mourn. She stopped about 6 feet from the group, close enough to speak without shouting, but far enough to keep a respectful distance. The silence stretched for a moment, broken only by the sound of distant birds and the occasional clink of a beer can. Mary took a deep breath, and in that moment, she remembered something her father used to say. Sometimes the smallest voice can speak the biggest truth. Her hands had stopped shaking. Looking directly at the leader, she noticed his eyes. They were a pale blue, and there was something in them that didn't match his intimidating appearance. She'd seen that look before, in the eyes of people who came to the hospital carrying heavy burdens of grief and regret. Some of the bikers shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. They were used to people looking away, crossing the street to avoid them, or hurrying past with fearful glances. This small woman in simple clothes, looking at them like she could see right through their tough exteriors, was something new. Mary glanced at the cigarette butts scattered on the grass near a veteran's headstone. Without a word, she bent down and started picking them up, one by one. The silence grew heavier. A few of the bikers looked away, and one even sat up straighter, removing his boots from the bench. As she stood back up, holding the cigarette butts in her cupped hand, she noticed something else about the leader. His vest had a small pin, partially hidden under a larger patch. It was a Marine Corps emblem, tarnished with age but still recognizable. Her father had worn one just like it. The breeze picked up, carrying the sweet scent of the flowers she'd been placing at the graves all morning. Here, surrounded by leather-clad bikers who could easily intimidate someone twice her size, Mary felt strangely calm. These men might look tough, but she had spent years helping people face their deepest fears and most painful moments. This was no different. She took another small step forward, her shoes now at the edge of the shadow cast by their parked bikes. The ground here was sacred, not just because of who was buried beneath it, but because of what they had died believing in. The idea that courage comes in many forms, and that standing up for what's right is always worth the risk. The leader's eyes met hers, and in that moment, something passed between them. A kind of understanding that went beyond words. Mary opened her mouth to speak, knowing that what she said next would either bridge a gap or widen it forever. Sometimes, she knew, the bravest thing you can do is simply tell the truth with love. Little did she know, her next words would not only change this moment, but would start a chain of events that would touch countless lives in ways she could never have imagined. In that hushed morning air, Mary's voice came out clear and steady, carrying across the space between her and the bikers. "The man buried right there," she said, pointing to a nearby headstone, "is my father. He was a Marine. He fought in Vietnam." Her words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning. The leader's eyes flickered to the grave she pointed to, then back to her face. Some of the other bikers shifted in their seats, the tough expressions on their faces wavering slightly. The sound of a beer can being crushed broke the silence, making Mary wince, but she kept her eyes locked on the leader. "Every single person buried in this cemetery," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "fought for something bigger than themselves. They fought for our freedom, the same freedom that lets you ride those bikes and live the way you choose." She paused, letting her words sink in. A couple of the bikers glanced at each other, and one quietly set his beer down on the ground. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows from the headstones across the carefully maintained grass. The leader stood up slowly, his full height towering over Mary. Up close, she could see the lines etched deeply in his face, telling stories of hard years and harder choices. His leather vest creaked as he moved, and the Marine Corps pin on his chest caught the sunlight. "These men and women," Mary said, gesturing to the endless rows of white headstones stretching out behind her, "they gave everything they had. Some died young, far from home. Others came back changed forever. But every single one of them deserves our respect. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, thinking of her father's own struggles after returning from war. The sound of distant traffic floated over the cemetery walls, a reminder of the world going on as usual beyond these sacred grounds. But here, in this moment, time seemed to stand still. The younger bikers watched their leader, waiting to see how he would respond to this small woman who dared to stand up to them. Mary noticed something change in the leader's expression. The hard mask he wore seemed to crack, just a little. His hands, covered in faded tattoos, opened and closed at his sides. She saw his throat work as he swallowed hard, and for a moment he looked past her at the rows of graves with an expression that made her heart ache. "My father used to say," Mary added softly, "that courage isn't just about fighting wars. Sometimes it's about how we treat the memory of those who fought them." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the cigarette butts she'd picked up, holding them out like evidence in a gentle accusation. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of the flowers she'd been placing at graves earlier, mixing with the leather and motorcycle exhaust. A flag snapped in the wind somewhere behind them, the sound sharp and clear like a military salute. The leader took a deep breath, and Mary could see the tough exterior crumbling. His blue eyes, which had seemed so cold before, were now shining with something that looked suspiciously like tears. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if the words he wanted to say were stuck somewhere deep inside. The other bikers watched in stunned silence. They'd seen their leader in bar fights and road battles, but they'd never seen him like this, struggling to find words, his usual confidence stripped away by this quiet woman's simple truth. What happened next would shock everyone present, changing not just this morning, but many mornings to come. Because sometimes the biggest transformations start with the smallest moments of honesty, and the truth, spoken with courage and compassion, has a power all its own. The leader of the bikers was about to reveal something that would transform this confrontation into something none of them could have expected, least of all Mary herself. The leader of the bikers reached up and slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes filled with tears. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he tucked the glasses into his vest pocket. The other bikers watched in shocked silence. They'd never seen their tough-as-nails leader show such raw emotion. "My brother," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "my little brother Tommy is buried somewhere in this cemetery." He gestured vaguely at the rows of white headstones stretching out behind Mary. He was a Marine too. Afghanistan. The words seemed to catch in his throat, and he had to take a deep breath before continuing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as he spoke, telling a story he'd kept buried for years. Tommy had been the good one, he explained. While he'd been getting into trouble with bikes and bars, Tommy had enlisted, wanting to make their mom proud. The last time they'd spoken was over a scratchy phone line, Tommy promising he'd be home soon. "I got the news 3 weeks later," the leader said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was in the middle of a bar fight when Mom called." He looked down at his hands, as if seeing the old scars there in a new light. I couldn't even bring myself to come to the funeral. What right did I have? I was nothing but a disappointment to him." The other bikers had moved closer now, forming a circle around their leader and Mary. Some removed their caps, holding them against their chests without even seeming to realize they were doing it. The tough exteriors were cracking, revealing the human hearts beneath all that leather and attitude. "I've been trying to work up the courage to visit for years," he continued, gesturing at his bike. "That's why we're here today. But I couldn't do it sober, couldn't face him clean. The guys, they don't even know why we really came. They just followed me, like always." He wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. Mary looked at the leader with new understanding. Behind the intimidating exterior was a brother drowning in grief and guilt, using alcohol and bad behavior to numb the pain of loss. She'd seen it before in her years as a nurse. How grief can wear so many different disguises. The sound of a beer and hitting the grass made everyone turn. One of the younger bikers had set his drink down and was removing his leather vest, carefully folding it and placing it on his motorcycle seat. Without a word, others began to do the same, as if shedding armor they no longer needed. My brother, the leader's voice cracked again. He died trying to save his whole unit. They gave him a medal for it. And here I am, disrespecting the very ground he's buried in. The shame in his voice was painful to hear. He looked at the cigarette butts still in Mary's hand, and his face reddened with embarrassment. The morning breeze carried the sweet scent of Mary's flowers across the cemetery, a gentle reminder of why she came here every Sunday. She saw something familiar in the leader's pain, the same hurt she'd seen in her father's eyes when he talked about the friends he'd lost in Vietnam. How long? Mary asked softly. How long have you been carrying this weight alone? The leader looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing past her small stature to the strength within. 7 years, he admitted. 7 years of riding past these gates, trying to find the courage to come in. 7 years of being too ashamed to face him. The silence that followed was different from the tense quiet of earlier. It was a silence full of understanding, of shared pain, of the possibility of healing. The tough biker gang had transformed into a group of vulnerable human beings, each carrying their own hidden burdens. What happened next would show how the deepest wounds can begin to heal when we find the courage to face them, and how sometimes the most unlikely people can help us find our way back to what matters most. Mary didn't hesitate. Let me help you find him, she said softly, reaching for the small notebook she always carried in her pocket. She'd spent so many years in this cemetery that she knew its layout like the back of her hand. Do you remember his full name and the year? She asked, her pen ready. The leader's voice shook as he spoke. Thomas Wilson Baker, 2016. He watched as Mary wrote it down, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. The other bikers had gathered closer, their earlier rowdiness replaced by a respectful silence. One of them quietly started picking up the scattered beer cans. As Mary flipped through her notebook, she shared little stories about the cemetery. How she'd learned all the sections, how she'd made friends with veterans' families over the years, how sometimes she'd sit and talk with them about their loved ones. Her gentle voice seemed to ease some of the tension from the leader's shoulders. Your brother, she said, looking up from her notes, he would be in Section E. That's where most of our Afghanistan veterans rest. She pointed toward a quiet corner of the cemetery where the morning sun was just beginning to touch the headstones. Would you like me to show you? The leader nodded, unable to speak. His second-in-command stepped forward, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. We'll all go, he said, looking around at the group. The others nodded, their faces showing a mix of concern and support for their leader. The walk to Section E was slow and quiet. Mary led the way, with the leader just behind her. The sound of their boots on the grass seemed unusually loud in the morning stillness. She could hear someone quietly crying behind them, but nobody turned to look. These tough men were learning that tears weren't a sign of weakness. Mary had taught many families how to navigate the rows of headstones, but never quite like this. She explained how the sections were organized, how to read the row numbers, how to find their way back if they got turned around. The bikers listened intently, their faces showing a new kind of respect, not just for her, but for the sacred ground they walked on. As they got closer to Thomas's section, the leader's steps got slower. Mary noticed his breathing getting heavier, his hands starting to shake again. Without a word, one of his friends moved closer, walking shoulder to shoulder with him. Sometimes the strongest support comes without words. They turned down the row where Thomas rested, and Mary heard the leader's sharp intake of breath. She stopped a few feet away from the headstone, giving him space. The white marble gleamed in the morning sun, the engraving clear and sharp. Thomas Wilson Baker, Lance Corporal, United States Marine Corps. The leader stood frozen, staring at his brother's name. 7 years of avoided griefs seemed to hit him all at once. His knees buckled slightly, and two of his friends, quickly moved to support him. But he waved them off, taking those final steps alone. When he reached the headstone, he dropped at his knees. His hand traced the letters of his brother's name, and the sound that came from him was pure anguish, the kind that comes from a wound that's been left to fester for far too long. Mary watched as the other bikers formed a protective circle around their leader, giving him the space to break down while still letting him know he wasn't alone. Some had tears streaming down their faces, others stood with heads bowed in respect. These weren't the same men who had roared into the cemetery an hour ago. "Hey, little brother," the leader whispered, his voice carrying in the morning quiet. "I'm sorry it took me so long to get here." His words were the beginning of a conversation 7 years overdue, and Mary knew this was just the first of many visits to come. Standing there, watching this moment of healing begin, Mary understood that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery happen not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we finally face our deepest fears and regrets. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as the leader remained kneeling at his brother's grave. Mary quietly took out her cleaning supplies from her bag, waiting for the right moment. When he finally looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, she stepped forward gently. "Would you like to learn how to clean his headstone?" she asked softly, holding out her soft brush. The leader nodded, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. His hands, used to gripping motorcycle handlebars and throwing punches, now trembled as they reached for the brush. Like this, Mary demonstrated, showing him how to spray the stone gently with water first. Always work from top to bottom, and be extra gentle around the letters. The leader followed her movements carefully, treating the marble with a tenderness that surprised even his closest friends. One of the younger bikers stepped forward, his voice hesitant. "Could you show me too?" he asked. "My uncle's buried here somewhere. Vietnam vet. I've never visited him either." Mary smiled warmly and pulled out another brush from her bag. Soon, other bikers began sharing their own connections to the veterans buried here. The transformation was remarkable. These men, who had arrived with such disruptive energy, were now working with quiet reverence. They spread out among the nearby graves, following Mary's instructions carefully. Someone began sharing memories of their own military service. Another spoke about a brother who never came home from Iraq. "The stone cleaner is in the blue bottle," Mary explained, moving from one biker to another, guiding their efforts. "Remember to rinse it well afterward." The sound of gentle water sprays and soft brushing replaced the earlier roar of motorcycles. Even the birds had returned, their songs mixing with the quiet conversations. The leader finished cleaning his brother's headstone and sat back on his heels, looking at how the marble gleamed in the sunlight. "He would have liked this," he said quietly. "Tommy always said we should take better care of each other." He reached out and traced the freshly cleaned letters with his fingertip. Mary opened her flower bag and pulled out several fresh blooms. "Would you like to place these?" she offered. The leader took them carefully, arranging them with surprising artistry at the base of the stone. Other bikers watched, then began asking about flowers for the graves they were tending. One of the older bikers discovered a veteran's grave that hadn't had visitors in years, judging by its condition. "Can we fix this one too?" he called out. Mary nodded, sharing her supplies. Soon they had a system going, some cleaning headstones, others trimming grass by hand, a few making runs to their bikes for water bottles to fill Mary's spray containers. The morning wore on, but nobody seemed to notice the time. Other cemetery visitors who had left earlier began returning, surprised to find the intimidating bikers down on their knees, tenderly caring for the graves. A few veterans who had come to visit friends smiled and nodded approvingly at the scene. "My brother," the leader said suddenly, standing up and addressing his group. "He died trying to save others. Maybe it's time we started living that way too." He looked around at his friends, who had stopped their work to listen. "What if we came back? Made this a regular thing?" The suggestion was met with immediate nods of agreement. These men, who had built their identities around being tough and unapproachable, had found something meaningful in this simple act of service. The layers of defensive attitude were peeling away, revealing the caring hearts beneath. Mary watched as they began making plans, discussing what supplies they'd need, talking about other veterans' cemeteries in neighboring towns, suggesting they reach out to veteran support groups. The transformation wasn't just in their actions. It was in their eyes, their voices, their whole way of being. This wasn't just about cleaning headstones anymore. It was about healing, about finding purpose, about honoring not just the dead but the living as well. As the morning light filled the cemetery, it illuminated more than just the gleaming white stones. It showed how the smallest acts of kindness could light the way toward redemption. A week later, the Sunday morning quiet was broken by the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But this time, when the bikes rolled through the cemetery gates, they moved slowly, respectfully. The leader had modified their exhausts to be quieter, and each bike carried bags of cleaning supplies strapped to their sides. Mary looked up from the grave she was tending and smiled. The bikers parked in an orderly line, each rider carrying something different. Fresh flowers, cleaning brushes, water jugs, even small American flags. They had taken off their more aggressive patches, replacing them with new ones that read Veterans Honor Guard. "Morning, ma'am," the leader called out as he walked over. His face was cleaner now, his beard trimmed. The other bikers spread out through the cemetery, each heading to sections they had chosen to care for. Some had even brought their own families, wives, children, parents who wanted to be part of this new mission. Two older veterans who visited the cemetery regularly watched in amazement as the bikers set up their cleaning stations. Last week's transformation had spread by word of mouth through the veteran community. Today, several former servicemen had come specifically to meet these unlikely caretakers. "My grandson was a Marine," one elderly veteran said, approaching the group slowly. "Would you mind if I helped?" The bikers welcomed him warmly, showing him their cleaning technique, listening intently to his stories about his own service and his grandson's sacrifice. The morning unfolded in a rhythm of gentle work and shared stories. The leader moved from grave to grave, not just cleaning, but taking time to read each name, sometimes looking up their stories on his phone. He'd started keeping a notebook of his own, recording the names and dates, determined that these veterans would never be forgotten. A young woman arrived with her small children, hesitant at first when she saw the bikers. But when she recognized them from the previous week, she relaxed. Her kids were fascinated by the motorcycles, and soon the tough-looking riders were showing them how to place flags correctly and teaching them about respecting veterans. "Tommy would have loved this," the leader said quietly to Mary as they worked side by side. "He always said I had a good heart, just needed to use it right." He looked around at his transformed gang, now scattered across the cemetery, doing careful, loving work. Guess he was right about that. More visitors began arriving, and instead of hurrying away, they stayed to watch and help. The bikers shared their supplies freely, teaching others the proper way to care for the headstones. Someone brought coffee and donuts, and small groups formed during breaks, sharing stories about their loved ones buried here. A local news photographer who happened to be passing by stopped to take pictures. The contrast was striking. Tough-looking bikers in leather vests, tenderly cleaning veterans' graves, teaching children about sacrifice and respect. But he captured something even more powerful: the genuine care in their eyes, the gentle way they handled the cleaning tools, the respect with which they treated every name carved in stone. As the morning went on, something beautiful happened. The barriers between different groups of people, bikers, veterans, families, regular visitors, began to fade away. They were all just people now, united in their desire to honor those who had served and sacrificed. The leader stood up from a freshly cleaned grave and looked around at the scene. Sunlight sparkled off clean headstones, fresh flowers added splashes of color, and the sound of respectful conversations filled the air. This wasn't just about making up for past mistakes anymore. It had become something bigger, something that was changing not just the bikers, but everyone who witnessed their transformation. Next week, he announced during their break, we're bringing more flags. And I've got 3 other biker groups who want to join us. The others nodded enthusiastically. What had started as one man's journey to face his grief had grown into a movement of healing and hope. Mary watched it all with quiet joy, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes start with the smallest acts of courage. The cemetery had become more than a place of mourning. It was now a place where healing happened every Sunday morning, one clean headstone at a time. 6 months had passed since that first confrontation in the cemetery. The story of the bikers and their transformation had spread far beyond their small town. What started with one group of 12 had grown into a movement that touched hearts across the country. On this particular Sunday morning, the cemetery was filled with the gentle rumble of motorcycles arriving from 3 different states. Each group had their own patches now, all variations on the theme of honoring veterans. The original leader stood at the gates, greeting new arrivals with a warmth that still surprised those who had known him in his darker days. A news crew was setting up their equipment near the cemetery entrance. They weren't the first. The story had already been featured in local papers and on regional news shows. But this was different. A national network had sent reporters to cover what they called the Sunday morning miracle. Mary watched from her usual spot, her heart full as she saw families arriving with their children, carrying flowers and cleaning supplies. The kids no longer feared the bikers. Instead, they ran to greet their favorite uncles, eager to help with their important work. The tough riders had become gentle teachers, showing young hands how to care for the graves of heroes. Did you ever imagine this? The leader asked Mary, walking over with a fresh cup of coffee for her. His eyes were clear now, no longer haunted by guilt and grief. He still visited his brother's grave every Sunday, but now he brought stories of hope and redemption to share. The movement had sparked something beautiful. Other veterans' cemeteries across the country had started their own programs, inspired by what was happening here. Biker groups, once known for causing trouble, were now competing to see who could do the most good. They called themselves the Memorial Guards, and their patches had become symbols of respect and honor. A group of elderly veterans arrived in a small bus from the local retirement home. The bikers hurried to help them off the bus, handling wheelchairs and walkers with gentle care. These Sunday gatherings had become a bridge between generations, where stories of service and sacrifice were shared and preserved. Near the center of the cemetery, a new memorial had been installed. It was a simple granite bench with words etched into its surface, "Where healing begins." It had been donated by the bikers, a testament to their own journey from pain to purpose. Families often sat there, sharing their stories with others who understood their loss. The original group had expanded their mission beyond just cleaning graves. They now organized veteran support groups, helped military families in need, and mentored troubled youth. The leader often spoke at schools, sharing his story of transformation and teaching kids about respect, redemption, and the true meaning of courage. Mary's quiet Sunday ritual had grown into something she could never have imagined. But the heart of it remained the same, honoring those who had served, remembering their sacrifices, and helping others heal. She still arrived early each Sunday, spending quiet moments with the graves before others arrived. The sound of children's laughter mixed with the gentle conversations of adults filled the morning air. Where once there had been silence and forgotten graves, now there was life and remembrance. Families who had stopped visiting their loved ones' graves years ago were returning, drawn by the atmosphere of healing and hope. A young veteran, recently returned from overseas, stood watching the scene with tears in his eyes. This, he said to no one in particular, "This is what we fought for." The leader walked over and put an arm around his shoulders, inviting him to join their circle of healing. As the morning sun climbed higher, Mary looked around at what one small act of courage had created. The cemetery had become more than a place of rest for heroes. It was now a living memorial, where the past and present met in acts of love and service, where broken hearts found healing, and where the true spirit of America's heroes lived on through the most unlikely of guardians. The legacy of that first confrontation continued to grow, touching more lives with each passing Sunday, proving that it's never too late to change, to heal, to find purpose in serving others. And somewhere, Mary knew, Tommy was smiling down at his big brother, proud of the man he had finally become.